Let's do it. Let's bring in Deontay Lee, our friend now. Deontay, do we have you?
Yes, I am here. What's going on, fellas?
How are you? Thanks for joining us. Always good to see you during draft season.
I'm doing well, man. Missed you at the athletic mixer this combine, man. You know, it was good catching up with you a couple years ago. Wish you could have done so at the combine this past year, but no, I'm doing well. Good to see you guys. Always glad to talk Eagles and talk football in general.
Awesome. Well, we are happy to have you. I want to start with a big picture question, which I think is an important one at Edge specifically, which is when you are evaluating these guys, how do you weigh what you see when you watch on tape? You know, just trusting your eyes versus the profile of the guy. Like this is a 24-year-old. Let's use Jared Verse as an example, right? Who played 2 years at Albany. You know, then goes to Florida State. Like, is he just overpowering guys who he's much bigger than? How do you go about weighing those two things when you're sort of stacking your proverbial board?
I would say you start with film always, right? Like you always want to start with the film just to get kind of a feel for how a guy plays. I think as the process goes on, especially once you get to the pro day and combine circuits, everything from there is just about thresholds athletically, right? I want to see arm length. Do you meet the 3-cone threshold, which I feel like I almost have to toss out now because nobody does anything but the 40.
Nobody does it
in Indianapolis anymore, right? But when there was a point in time where everybody was participating, I wanted to see guys that, you know, were sub 7.2 in the 3-cone. And if you're sub 7 seconds, it's like, all right, that's a bendy guy, right? That's a guy who has great contact balance, somebody who can, you know, work the edge, relentless pressure guy, right? And then from there, you're going to take those thresholds and go back to the film. And that's where you can kind of start drawing dividing lines between guys, right? So for this year, there was a lot of returning to the film for Laiatu Latu, really to see like, okay, I think he's got the arm length. I love the way that he approaches pass rushing. Let me really spend some time watching him as a run defender, right? So that way I can kind of draw a line between him and a Jared Verse, who is maybe not as good in terms of pass rush plan, but I know he's a dog as a run defender, right? And I want to kind of weigh what those two things are. And that's just up and down the list, right? Same with Dallas Turner. This was a long conversation last year with our old friends at The Athletic when we were talking about like Will Anderson, right? Because that's a guy who had a lot of numbers, but if you watch, it's like undersized guy who's not a Von Miller type of rusher. I want to understand whether or not this is just his first step is better than a future accountant's, you know, pass set. Right. You know, so I think that there's a lot of that. So I go film, threshold, athletically in terms of size and speed and explosiveness. And then you go back to the film to kind of create your final tiers. And I think I like tiers a little bit better than ranking. So that's kind of the way I've approached it lately.
For the viewers who are kind of just catching on to the PHLY Eagles show, we should say that Deontay, even though he lives out in Southern California, follows the Eagles quite a bit. Grew up an Eagles fan, right? And so right. we can get esoteric about former Eagles edge rushers, and he would know what we're talking about. But Deontay, the question I want to throw out you, or I should say throw at you, and I'm struggling with it with this year's class, is edge rusher such an important position. We know that every team can use an edge rusher. It's one of those spots you can never have too much of it. But
tell it to the Eagles.
True. But that said, this does not strike me as a particularly good edge rusher class. Do you know, and you look at, I don't think it's as deep. I don't think it's as top heavy as some other years when you have guys going in the top 5, multiple guys in the top 10. Do you find yourself trying to talk yourself into the edge rushers more this year because it's a premium position, or am I overstating the weakness of this year's class?
I would go the opposite direction. I think because it's such a premium position, I have probably found myself drawing a harder line on what I am and am not comfortable with in terms of draft ranges for guys. And for this draft, if you're not like in the top 35, and I think even that's being a little bit generous, it's probably closer to like top 20, top 25 because of the premium on the position, you're probably not going to be leaving with a guy at this position that you're going to feel like has Pro Bowl potential or consistent potential, right? Like if we're going to use a Danielle Hunter or a Jonathan Grenard, maybe as like a baseline of a pass rusher that even if he's not an all-star player, you're happy with because he's getting consistent production. I don't know if you're finding that guy after the top 20 to 25 picks.
Yeah, I think that sort of seems the case. And because of that relative weakness, those guys will get pushed up the board because of the position. So when it comes to that, let's go through those top guys, because it sort of seems to us like, maybe there's 4 guys in conversation for the first round. Let's start with Latu Latu from UCLA. Started at Washington, had to medically retire. Then he comes back and lights it up for the Bruins. To me, he looks awesome on tape. We have no way of knowing the medicals, how that stuff will check out. How did he look to you?
I love the guy. I love the pass rush plan. Right. That's one thing that sticks out on tape, especially in comparison with the other guys in this class, is from a hand fighting perspective, from knowing how to work different angles, from being able to work inside and out. I think that he's probably the most complete pass rusher that we have in this class. Tall guy, long arms, pretty good athleticism. I think all those explosiveness and speed scores are at about baseline for what you want in an edge rusher, especially a taller guy. So I think that there's a lot to be happy with. Again, if there's somebody I am going to bet on to be consistent year in and year out, assuming that the medicals are fine, like you mentioned, I think that that's a guy I would take a chance on. And a better run defender, I think, that I gave him credit for when I first started going through these guys. I thought that he would lean a little bit more on the Chop Robinson side. I heard you guys kind of discussing him earlier, and I went back to his film and I saw a lot more competitiveness. I don't think he's going to walk in and be a Will Anderson and be setting edges, like he's a 10-year vet from day one. But I do think that this is a guy that can be league average or better as a run defender. And you see all the potential in the world for him as a pass rusher, because it's not just being a first step guy. It's not just trying to bend the edge. It's having hands, it's having counters, being able to work inside and out, and always pushing the pocket. And I think I'm falling more in love with players that profile that way than the guys who are maybe kind of like more one-dimensional, one note as pass rushers. So I love him. As far as pure pass rushers, he's probably my number one.
So the opposite end of the spectrum there would be Chop Robinson, like you mentioned, who doesn't have the sack production, but athletically and the traits, it's almost off the charts. How do you kind of rationalize the lack of sack production with what you're seeing when you're watching the athletic testing and just looking at the measurables?
I think, again, it comes back to plan, right? It comes back to down execution. And I think that guys that are more of your speed rushers, your bend the edge types, your get off and go types of guys, they're going to wax and wane, I think, in production, right? You're playing in the Big Ten. You're probably only going to get so many quality opportunities pass rush wise, but you turn on the tape and you watch him. And when it works, when he gets off the ball, you can see where that 40 time comes from, right? You can see where the broad and vertical jumps and all the speed scores and explosiveness scores come from. And if he gets a beat on a guy where he can bend the edge, he's going to get to your quarterback quickly. The issue is twofold. What happens when that doesn't work? And you automatically have to assume coming into the league, these guys have seen the best speed rushers that there are in the world. I don't think that he's going to step in and be one of the best speed rushers in the league from day one. So then the concern is, does he have a counter? I don't think that you see a counter in his plan on tape that pops snap after snap, game after game, right? That's number one. And then number two, and then this is something that makes him a big issue for me, is what he is as a run defender, or what he isn't, I guess I should say, as a run defender, right? Like, this isn't Nolan Smith, who you guys brought up in reference to him. With Nolan Smith, you watch that guy at the point of attack, and you could say, you could buy into the fact that even though he's probably sub 240 playing, this is a guy who is going to put his foot down and set an edge, or at least compete for it. Right. And that gives you a baseline to build off of when you combine that with his speed. With Chop Robinson, there's so many snaps where he's to the boundary, or he's away from a tight end, or he's on the side of the field where, his defensive coordinator feels like the ball is not going in the run game, so he can just be a pure pass rusher. I'm never in love with guys that step in and I have to feel like they're designated pass rush guys. And in the context of the Eagles, they just paid a guy to be a designated pass rusher in Bryce Huff, right? So, and you already have Nolan Smith, who you're probably developing to be a designated pass rush guy. So, there's a bit of duplicity in the roster that exists already, and I don't think it makes sense to add another guy who's within that type of athletic profile. So for me, in the context of the Eagles, I probably would have him more leaning off the board. And in the context of this class, that's like a late first, early second. If you're taking that guy, you're just betting on the fact that the athletic traits are going to play out in a way that's advantageous for you. But I don't know if I'd be confident in that if I'm the one running the team.
I think all of this comes down to sort of a big picture conversation that we had a little bit with Fran Duffy yesterday about offensive linemen. And that is like, what is teachable versus what is like a hard cutoff. And like when
Right.
it comes to run defense, like if it's the guy's not going to be big enough to get it done, that's one thing. But if you are seeing a guy who's like, the technique is bad or he's not trying hard enough, is that a kind of thing where you feel like if we get him to our coaches and we trust our coaches, this is a thing that can improve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's Tyree Wilson last year, right?
Mm.
You watch a guy who's like he's really raw, but you look at the size, you look at the tools, and you see just enough on tape where it's like, all right, if we get his hands right, if we get his footwork right, if we get him out of his stance properly, that's a guy who can profile to be a dominant edge rusher potentially. Or even if it's not dominant, a guy who we know we can stick on the edge in a 3-4 or a 4-3, and he can go set an edge for us or be disruptive in the backfield. When you look at Chop Robinson, it's not like you're getting a lot of run stuffs and TFLs, even as more of like a weak side edge guy, where you can say, hey, if we cut him loose, we'll take some chances on maybe, teams cutting back off of this guy or being able to find some explosive plays off of him because we know he's going to go beat a blocker and get TFLs, right? Like, I don't think that he meets that profile. And when you think about undersized guys, and you brought it up, being able to be kind of esoteric about old edge rushers for the Eagles, I think about Trent Cole coming in as an undersized guy. And that was a guy whose physical frame, suggested that he could add weight, which he did throughout his career. And you watch the college tape, you watch him early in the league, and you see a guy who on motor, on technique, on effort, is making plays or affecting the game in a way that makes you encouraged about what he's going to look like in his prime. When you look at Chop Robinson, man, I think there's a lot of projection you would have to take on to say that that's a guy that can be a league average or better run defender. And that's just not something I'm comfortable with as you see offenses get more invested in trying to run the ball to get teams out of these too high shells. That's not a guy I think that fits perfectly in today's defensive meta.
So I know we're talking edge rusher specifically, but I do want to open this up big picture with you. Given the context of what we're talking about, do you think, and what you know about the Eagles, what you know about this year's draft, do you think edge rusher should be in play for the Eagles 22 at number 22, or do you think they're better off drafting a different position there?
I kind of look at it as two pathways, right? It all depends on what's available. I think that one of an edge and one of a corner is eventually going to slide because this is a draft that's so heavy on tackles, so heavy on wide receivers, and it's going to be so quarterback centric in the top 10, right? So I think that if you're Howie, you're probably lining up scenarios of, hey, are we going to be dealing with Nate Wiggins versus Laiatu Latu debate? And I think if it's one of those two, you probably lean edge, right? Now, if the edge rusher is more the Chop Robinsons, go and then the next tier of guys behind that, and maybe there's a Kool-Aid McKinstry available instead. Let's say that all the corners and edge rushers end up in the first round. I would rather go Kool-Aid there and say, all right, we've got our contingency for James Bradberry. This is a guy who maybe is not an all-star athletically, but we might be able to drop him in the slot if we want to play Chauncey Gardner-Johnson deep the way that we had him the last time he was here. So that's something to me that I would have an eye on. In the amazing scenario, and I don't think this is happening at all, where like a Cooper DeJean slips. That's a guy, it's like you got to sprint to the table because he's so versatile as the defensive back. And you know that that's a major need still, is building those contingency plans and, just building quality depth in a guy who has a high ceiling, both on the perimeter as a corner and potentially as a safety. So I think it's like a multiple scenarios thing where it's like, what tier of edge is available? What tier of corner is available? If you can get those top Jared Verse or Latu guys, then I would take that. Anything else, I'm probably looking corner or trading back and maybe trying to add some draft capital.
I like that. Last thing on the edges is beyond round one. Who are the guys who you sort of have caught your eye and you have an affinity for if we're talking day 2, day 3?
So that's where it's kind of interesting, right? Like after day 1, I think you're really drafting more for role than you are like for ceiling. So for me, it's like, I think that if you look at what the Eagles had a lot of trouble with, it was setting edges in the run game. Who knows what this is going to look like with Vic Fangio in now. But I think if you're looking at the profile of outside backers that he's had at different stops and what's available in Philadelphia, body type wise, it doesn't exactly line up. So that concerns me in a little bit. And I would probably look at like a Chris Braswell if you can get him maybe in the 3rd round, who I think is going to step in and be a good run defender. The issue there is that the ceiling, I think, is limited as a pass rusher, but you can probably bring that guy in and play him opposite of Sweat and feel like, all right, we can get at least pretty good run defense out of one guy, and that maybe frees Sweat up to be more of a pass rush guy. Jonah Ellis is another high effort guy. Maybe he turns into something. You can take a chance on him in the third and the fourth, right? Those are the edge guys I will be looking at. Corners wise, it's interesting. It's interesting to me because it doesn't seem like there's much of an appetite in Philly to change Bradbury's role, right? I don't think that Bradbury is very comfortable playing in the slot, which is fair, right? That's a big change for you positionally if you're a defensive back. So then there are guys like Andrew Phillips from Kentucky, who is a mid-round guy. You might be able to drop him in the slot. He can play. He's not a first-round guy. I'm interested to see how the league feels about Kamari Lassiter outside of his pro day, where the 40 times that came out were, some people say 4.6, some people say mid 4.5s. Either way, I don't think that people think of him as a traditional outside corner the way that they did in season. If you can get your hands on a guy like that, that's someone who can be a corner 2, maybe, but you can drop him in the slot, good tackler, guy who can fit the run, use him as a blitzer if you need to. I will be interested in that. And then obviously there's linebacker. And I know for me, that has to be addressed in this defense. If it's me, I don't know what Howie Roseman's appetite for doing that is, but I think if a Junior Colson is available in the third round, and maybe he's not because there just aren't many playable linebackers in this class, you can go get that guy. If he's not there, maybe you get a Peyton Wilson. If he slips, maybe you get an Edgerrin Cooper. But all those guys at those positions are projects, in my opinion. Good athletes, but guys who I think, similar to tight end on the offensive side of the ball, you might not get return on investment until year 3. So maybe you try to take those guys and develop them behind some veterans. But there's not a lot to love in this class after you get outside of like the top 45 on the defensive side of the ball.
Well, Deontay Lee, unbelievable level of expertise that you have brought to the show today. Thank you so much. And tell us for everybody listening where they can follow you.
Thank you, man. I always appreciate coming on. Right now, I'm freelancing with 33rd Team. So if you want to yell at me for a mock draft, you can find it there. Definitely want to make sure I finish out this draft cycle, giving you guys content. And then after that, we'll see, man. Been looking at some different avenues, some different ways to stay connected to football. But as long as I'll be in the media, you can see me on 33rd Team. I'll probably be guesting on the Athletic Football Show in the coming days. You might hear me there in the medium-term future, and then we'll see from there. You can always follow me on Twitter at Deontay Lee FB, and I'll be talking ball with you guys there.
Well, awesome. And just so you know, Deontay, the chat is lighting up. We want more Deontay. So
I appreciate you guys.
Impression. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I love you guys, man. Have a good one.
Good to see you. Thanks, Deontay.
We all silly like the mayor.